Long before science, long before secularism, there was a spark, the beginning of a shift between old thinking and newer thinking. We call this the Axial Age, and I'll talk more about that here in a second, but it is this transition point in history that happened within a few hundred years all over Eurasia. People that had never met, whose roads would have never crossed, who didn't share the same map, started to ask the same questions. You might be surprised who we'll focus on today, but some teasers here. Imagine in Athens, a barefoot man walking through the market, asking questions that no one else dares to voice. Or in India during this time frame, a prince abandons comfort and wealth, seeking to understand suffering instead of to escape it. In China, a teacher speaks not of spirits and omens, but of character and duty and social harmony. In Persia, a prophet declares that the universe is a battleground, but not between gods and men, but between the truth and a lie. Even in Israel, voices start to cry out, not to praise the temple, but to condemn it sometimes, to denounce kings, denounce priests, denounce the powerful, and to call for reform. Now, each of these have their own issues, but today we're going to focus on how they were important moments, all happening in similar time frames, leading thought, maybe to a level that we might disagree with today, as that thought has continued to evolve, but such an important pivot in history. This was a revolution of the mind. How should we live? What does it mean to live well? What is truth? What is good? Why do the innocent suffer? And on and on and on. You can see it in the quotes that we all know so well. Socrates says the unexamined life is not worth living. The Buddha says that all conditioned things are unsatisfactory. To know this is to be free. Confucius gives us the real golden rule. Do not do unto others what you would not have done to yourself. They did more than just ask new questions. They started to question the questions themselves. So again, historians call this the Axial Age, from the word axis for turning point. And that's exactly what this is in history. It's so cool to zoom out and see collected, even if separated, human history unfold in a similar manner. It's usually the German philosopher in 1949, Karl Jaspers, who gets credited with this term. And he does give credit to some people who had started to put this notion forward before his time, but one person he leaves off that we can track it all the way back to is from 1873, John Stuart Glennie. Glennie had called it the moral revolution. And both Jaspers and Glennie referred to the Axial Age in their own way and agreed that it should be taken as an objective empirical fact of history and that it should be looked at independently of religious considerations. So that's what we're going to do today. That's why we're even including what was going on with the Israelites at this time. Because before this age, it is gods that explain thunder or fertility or fate. But after this age, humans begin to seek better answers. They begin to seek truth through thought, not through ritual. Again, not all at once, not all to the same degree, but this shift has started. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Quick agenda. Let's talk more about what the Axial Age is. Let's talk about this mental shift from mythos to logos. Let's talk about the thinkers themselves who changed these things, going through those 5 main categories that I started the episode with. And then, like always, we'll end with why should we care? What are we to learn from this? How does it affect our life today? What is the legacy of these events in history? So I'm very excited for today's episode. Kind of fun to focus on a more abstract concept. If you like these episodes of Thinking Thursday, right now, would you just stop and make sure that you have subscribed, turned on notifications, hit the like button, commented, do all the things. I ask because these are our least watched episodes, but they are my favorite to make and to share and to hear your guys' feedback on. And there's a wonderful group of you that are here for each of them, but I'd love to help grow this part of the channel. So thank you very much, and let's dive straight into more of what the Axial Age was. Just imagine if, without ever speaking to each other, 5 different people all started dreaming the same dream. Not a dream of power, nor of conquest, but of justice and truth and what it means to, again, live a good life. That's the mystery and the magic of the Axial Age. No, I don't think it's something divine or that the gods started to tweak the minds of humans at that time. I think it was a natural evolution for parts of the world that had reached a certain point but started to move beyond that. A collective happening, whether there's evolutionary features going on or simple coincidence. So if I haven't been clear, this age is roughly 800 BCE to 200 BCE. There's exceptions and some are further forward in this new thinking than others. But again, this is the hinge, these centuries upon which the entire world shifted. A quote from Jaspers here: "The spiritual foundations of humanity were laid simultaneously and independently. These are the foundations upon which humanity still subsists today." And yes, there are many scholars that critique or refine the model, but few deny that something remarkable happened during this time frame. So let's talk about the geography of the Axial Age. 5 major regions underwent this transformation in thinking. You have Greece with Socratic reasoning and philosophical inquiry. You have India with Buddhism, the Upanishads, and inner liberation. China with Confucian order and the Taoist movement. Persia gives us Zoroastrian dualism and moral responsibility. And then Israel with prophetic justice and ethical monotheism. These were isolated and culturally distinct civilizations. No shared scripture, no shared contact, and no common political cause even. Again, it's just amazing to zoom out and witness this in human history right before us. We have everything we need to see it and group it and explain it and view where it led to. So, some common themes across these civilizations during this time frame. Inward reflection over outward ritual. Virtue was no longer just something you performed, it was something you became. Moral universals over tribal customs. Ethics begin to stretch beyond bloodline, beyond borders even. Justice became its own ideal, not just some act of divine favor. How should all people live? Replaced, what do the gods want from our particular tribe? Now, I feel the need to just give a caveat here. In talking like this, you might take it to mean that as soon as these particular thinkers or groups came along in these particular countries or regions, everything got better. There was no more slavery, there was no more selfishness, there was no more sacrifice or weird cult god worship, etc. That's not the case. It's a change in thinking, not necessarily action right away, but it's what led to so much of the future change that could come. This is a state change. Remember that. And again, some of these groups actually actualized these changes more than others, but just getting the thoughts out there, the words written down, seeing some of this, it's not to say, oh, they arrived. It's to say, oh, look, the change has started. A great questioning began of power in general, of kingship, of priestly authority. Socrates challenges the Athenian state. The Hebrew prophets are rebuking kings and priests. Buddha is rejecting caste and ritualism. Laozi, or sometimes I think Laozi, I'm never sure of the pronunciation, but this is the Tao Te Ching, dismisses rigid hierarchies. And Zoroaster emphasized individual moral agency. From divine stories of floods and wars to reflections on consciousness, ethics, and selfhood. This is the change from mythos to logos. So cool. Let's talk about that next a bit. A quote that I've heard about the Axial Age to help put it in its place is this: if the Enlightenment is when humanity began to think scientifically, then the Axial Age is when we begin to think existentially. So let's talk about this mental shift. Before the Axial Age, religion was less a path to truth and more a negotiation, a how to bargain with power, if you will. You obeyed, you sacrificed, maybe you would survive. So let's talk about this pre-axial world just a bit more, meaning through mythos. It was all about myth. Myth is what explained the world. Thunder was Zeus's rage. Crops grew because Demeter was pleased. Kings ruled because they were descendants of God. Illness meant you had angered the divine. The gods didn't need to be just powerful. And your job definitely wasn't to understand them. It was to appease them. Sacrifice back then wasn't symbolic, it was transactional. Divination, omens, oracles. These were who dictated decisions. Morality was obedience to tradition. It was a world of answers, but not questions. Then comes the shift. Logos emerges. Logos, which by the way is used differently for different cultures and time, but originally it's the Greek term for reason and order, the underlying structure of reality. Mythos gave meaning through story, through narrative, but Logos seeks it through analysis, through dialogue and reflection. So here comes the turn from what do the gods demand of us to what is right, what is even true. And that's where many atheists won't seem to care about this or understand this. They'll just say, look, they didn't trade in religion, they didn't trade in gods, they didn't come to the proper, correct understanding, they didn't wake up, they weren't free from these burdens, from these chains. No, but it started the reframing of religion. And we get these new questions that define the Axial Age mind. I've given you some of these already, but just to clarify, why do the innocent suffer? We see this in Job, which has been found to be written much later than originally thought, which makes sense here. We see it in Isaiah. We see it from Buddha, a concept not concerned with before. What is virtue, and can it even be taught? Socrates and Confucius. Is there a moral order to the universe? We see that with Zoroaster and Lao Tzu. What happens when I die? And should that shape how I live? The Upanishads and the Greek mystery cults. Should I obey an unjust law, even if it is from the gods? Socrates, and even again the Hebrew prophets we see struggling with this. For the first time, humans began to question if the gods were good, or whether goodness might exist past the gods. Again, not that there are no gods. Baby steps. We also see within this change the self becoming the sacred. Again, that battlefield of morality shifts inward. The soul or the mind become the new altar, and the sacrifice is no longer a goat. It was your pride, your greed, your ignorance. In India, self-inquiry becomes the path to liberation. In Greece, it's logic and reason that are the tools of virtue itself. In China, the term cultivating the self comes into play. It's how you bring harmony to yourself and your society. In Persia, the inner heart becomes the stage for cosmic truth. And in Israel, the conscious begins to get elevated above custom, above tradition. So again, the Axial Age does not replace religion. It simply redefines its purpose. No longer to control nature, but to understand the self. No longer to explain the cosmos, but to cultivate oneself. So I want to spend a little more time breaking down these 5 groups or regions that we've been talking about. Let's start with Greece, the birthplace of critical philosophy. I think it's a good place to start because most of us can think of the two sides, the before and after of Greece. Before, we see all of that great Greek myth and fate and divine politics. Morality was simply about honoring the gods, maybe even respecting social hierarchies. Gods were vindictive and jealous, petty, and cruel. Justice was arbitrary. The Delphic maxim is know thy place. But then we get the axial breakthrough for this region, mainly Socrates, happening from 469 to 399. He's the first to challenge here not just who is right, but what is right? And he refused to accept the typical answers of tradition or myth as justification for that answer. And we get the Socratic method to teach by questioning. He believed that both truth and virtue could be discovered, could be arrived at through rational dialogue, a truly revolutionary idea. And this challenged the state's power, popular opinion, religious dogma. I mean, this was offending everybody and every system, and he died for it. His death becomes the symbol for intellectual martyrdom, and we will do an entire Thinking Thursday episode on the death of Socrates. But that leads to Plato and to Aristotle. They build on Socrates and the introduction of the forms, ideal forms, these timeless truths about justice and virtue and beauty. Aristotle starts moving into the sciences even, emphasizing observation, logic, biology. He saw reason as the highest human function. This was the first time, really, that thought itself was considered sacred. And there's still tons of problems, and there was still a lot of inequality and a lot that needed to be caught up. The shift had started. Let's jump over to India, though, and see what they were up to. Prior to this, in India, you had the Vedic traditions. They centered on a rigid caste system, sacrifices, and priestly control. The gods demanded obedience. It was that simple. Morality was ritual performance, not ethical inquiry. So for India's axial breakthrough, we typically think of the Buddha. He rejects the caste system and Brahmin ritualism. He left his place to seek a solution to suffering, even when it wasn't affecting him. He taught the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. Liberation through mindfulness, through compassion, as well as non-attachment. So ethics became experiential, not inherited. Salvation was no longer reserved for the elites. Anyone could pursue enlightenment. This is an introduction of intentional morality and of being psychologically aware to the spiritual. It leads to the Upanishads, which are philosophical texts that are composed between 800 and 300 BCE. These are an exploration of what is the self, Atman? What is the universal reality, Brahman? And how do we get to liberation, to moksha? Well, probably not through sacrifice, maybe through knowledge. Again, still maintained its belief in cosmic justice and karma, sometimes still used to justify inequality. Some interpretations kept women in lower caste systems, but again, this is all an elevation. It's all bringing it to the individual, to our consciousness, not to ceremony and sacrifice and caste. Moving over to China, early Chinese religion centered on ancestor worship. Some divination, a lot of ritual control. Kings were these intermediaries between heaven and earth. Harmony just meant obedience. No reflection needed. Just shut up and do what you're told. So our axial breakthrough here is Confucius, arguing the very opposite. The virtue is not just obedience, but it's cultivated character. He taught that a moral society should ideally start with self-discipline and correct relationships. An introduction of these central concepts, Ren and Li. Ren being humaneness, empathy, compassion, dignity, and Li being this concept of social order, but through respectful behavior, not blind obedience. This is where we get the original famous golden rule quote: "Do not impose on others what you do not wish for yourself." A contemporary or slightly later is Lao Tzu, who authored the Tao Te Ching, presenting the Tao as the natural way of harmony. And by the way, this is probably my favorite ancient text. We'll do an entire episode on it. It encouraged non-intervention, humility, insight. Morality here becomes relational, it becomes secular, it becomes pragmatic, which is so amazingly mixed in with this otherwise still mysticism going on. We see this transition in China for this social ethic, this spiritual detachment from power. Again, not perfect, especially Confucianism in later dynasties became a bit rigid. Women's roles were often suppressed. There's critiques of that detachment. It could be used to avoid engagement with injustice. Still, what a shift. Cosmic obedience to ethical cultivation. We'll take it. And all along, no need to appeal to the gods. This one might end up being a longer episode. We'll see. Let's move on to Persia, though. So we're going to see some mirrors here between this and Israel, but I'll try to keep them distinct a little bit. Early Indo-Iranian religion was polytheistic, myth-heavy and animistic. Morality was not even yet a cosmic necessity, just ritual practice and tribal loyalty, until Zoroaster, where there's this introduction to a radical new thought or way of thinking, that the universe itself is a moral battleground. This is where we get Ahura Mazda, which many of you are probably familiar with, the wise, just creator god of truth, against Ingra Manu, the lie. Humanity was given the free will to choose between the two of them. This introduces judgment after death, heaven and hell, and final judgment. Again, maybe not as morally progressive as what we saw in the last three examples, but it is bringing this newness to the scene, these good ethics, good words, good deeds. It's about what we do, not just who we do it for or how we do it. And it's weird because in some ways it's kind of taking morality a step back by making it so cosmic, but in other ways it elevated where it was previously by giving choice to the matter, bringing in a moral accountability to this religious cosmology cosmology. Now, of course, the downside here is even more obvious than with the last three. It reinforces a very strong dualism, very black and white thinking, which we can actually blame for the apocalyptic thinking in later Abrahamic faiths. Thanks a lot. And of course, violence is still permitted within this kind of thinking, as long as it's in service of the divine order. That can be corrupt pretty quickly, pretty easily. But again, a shift nonetheless. Zoroaster gives us one of the earliest versions of a moral universe, not just a magical one. Now let's move to Israel. This one is so interesting because of how we've already covered so much of this time period, and we've been able to go into so much of what was still wrong, as there is with all of these stages, or I should say harmful, or not yet fully fleshed out, or mature, or all the way evolved. Not that we are now, but we do see a moral progression. And that means you have to take the changes, those little shifts, for what they were. Incomplete, but still advancement. So before the axial period, when we're talking about Israel, we have what we all know, the fiercely tribal, violent, and exclusive religion of Yahweh, the war god, concerned with land and bloodlines and perfect purity. Justice was equated with victory, not fairness. Were you on the right side at the right time? It's myth and magic everywhere. It's even polytheistic in parts of the Torah, looking at the earliest texts. A god very concerned with other gods, both false idols and real ones. A god that was clearly still evolving out of a Canaanite pantheon, but that ultimately switches into a monotheistic version after the Babylonian captivity. And around this time, we have our Axial Age influences within the Israel community, and that is some of the Hebrew prophets. Figures like Amos, Hosea, Micah, and Isaiah. They begin to challenge their own people. They spoke truth to power, to kings, to priests. Some, not all, rejected ritual sacrifice or sacrifice just for the sake of sacrifice, for the sake of ritual purity, as opposed to a better sign of worship, and even showing favor for ethical living over just the following of the tradition. Again, talk about pulling teeth, because they could only get us so far. And then when you start to look at some of the Catholic books of the canon, you start to fill in some of those gaps as we get closer and closer to Jesus and Paul and the New Testament writers. And it's this amazing evolution. It's why Jesus in some forms looks wholly unidentifiable with his father Yahweh. That transition took a lot of different periods, and this Axial Age is a big one, from moving beyond the Torah into the prophets. Again, I am bombarded with other examples even from these prophetic books of how immoral and lackluster this new thinking is. But in comparison to the beginning, it's progress, or at least setting up the potential for better progress. It's a religious tradition that does turn, for a time, its critique inward. That's really interesting. There is a calling out of economic injustice. There's a calling out of corruption. There's a calling out of hypocrisy. Again, they're still using the same bad yardstick, Yahweh's perfect nature, but the goalpost is still moving, and that's still good. But yes, they're still framed by tribal morality and oftentimes only applied to the Israelites. Their God still commanded genocide and slavery and rape. Justice that everyone is seeking after still came usually from divine retribution, not some healthy restorative act. They just couldn't quite escape their own theologies. But it seems they did strain against it a little bit in some ways. And maybe you're feeling like it's hard for me to say anything good about this particular group of people at this time. And that's not the case. The case is just the real history of these people groups, of these changes. If I didn't know anything or have any personal attachment or past exposure in Christianity, and I was still covering the Axial Age from just a history perspective, it is clear that the Israelite part of the Axial Age is the weakest. It is the most morally bankrupt. It is the one that did not advance from its roots as far as the others. Someone had to still be in last place. It's not my fault. And again, one of the big reasons we critique this particular religion so much is because of how additionally harmful it is. The Abrahamic faiths are in general, monotheistic faiths are in general. So I'm not picking on Christianity or the history of Judaism that leads to Christianity. It's just the historical reality. So, in general, in looking at these 5, though, these thinkers, of course, didn't build utopias. They didn't erase all their previous problems. They didn't end injustice or abolish war and slavery. They didn't erase the gods. So why do we care? Why are we giving them so much credit? Why is the Axial Age so special? Because they shifted the center of gravity from ritual to reflection, from divine obedience to, at the very least, ethical aspiration. So, with that said, let's move into our final part here, the legacy of it all. It as a catalyst in history, why it matters, and what we should learn from it. I get it. It's easy to dunk on and debunk old ancient belief systems and seemingly backwards moralities. How foolish of them to think lightning was from a god. How harmful and ridiculous to think that illness is demons. And those are great critiques when fighting against people that still claim the truth about these things and implement practices based off them that are harmful to human well-being. But that's not the full story, because buried in these flawed frameworks were the seeds of something extraordinary. The first real steps towards thinking, towards progress, towards spiritual maturity. So no, the Axial Age wasn't atheism. It was awakening. You're never going to leave the gods behind until you have this middle stage of questioning the gods. Not their existence, but their intentions, their power, their justice, their goodness, their use and utility. This is the real revolution of the Axial Age. To go from pleasing the gods at any cost to thoroughly considering and trying to understand the good, what we actually owe each other, what it actually means to be moral, to live well, to enhance the good for others. This was an utter dismantling of the mythic, not a total destruction or abandonment, a dismantling as in a renegotiation, a restructuring, like Buddha who keeps the metaphysics but loses the priests, or Socrates who acknowledges the divine mystery of it all, but insisted still on reason as the ultimate guide. Zarathustra recasting morality as a moral force instead of a cosmic tyrant. Confucius barely even mentions the divine. He was able to build on ethics without it. And again, at least the Hebrew prophets still challenged their own sacred systems in the name of justice. We needed these individuals. We needed these little shifts to happen. It's not to say someone else wouldn't have filled the gap differently in a different place or time, but in our history, we can see the clear alignment between Buddha and psychological liberation, between Socrates and Western philosophy, between Confucius and East Asian ethical systems. They cracked open the door that the Enlightenment would later walk through. You might not believe in any of their gods, but you're living in their world, a world shaped by being able to question, where before others had just knelt or bowed. The questions they asked are still our own. How should we live? What is justice? Do the gods play a part? Can suffering be transcended? Should suffering be abolished? What really matters most? Obedience or understanding, faith or reason? They raised a tension that still haunts us. It's everywhere. It's new, it's different, but it requires the same willingness to question, the same push to start a slow roll, a shift to evolve us higher into the next beautiful potential. We can see so many good things today that we could link all the way back to one of these Axial Age individuals or new modes of thought or question or philosophy. Mindfulness, trauma therapy, and meditation culture, back to Buddhism. Law, education, democracy, debate ethics, back to Socrates. Family ethics, respect for elders, duty-based systems, back to Confucius. Good versus evil narratives, savior tropes, back to Zoroastrianism. Liberation theology, universal reconciliation, though still problematic in modern or recent Christianity, doesn't happen without that middle stage from the prophets. The Axial Age, again, is a bridge, not a destination. These thinkers, I can't even imagine what it would be like to be them for a second because they were so utterly consumed with the truth to them of the matter, that the gods were so real in a system where religion ruled everything. So no matter how far they made it, the fact that they thought against this system at all, that they dared to carve out just enough space for themselves, for human reason or personal virtue or universal questions, is amazing and something we owe a debt of gratitude toward. So they didn't get us all the way to skepticism, but they got us off the ground. And without them, your skepticism, your freedom to doubt, your ability to question doesn't exist. So I hope that you enjoyed this. I hope you learned something. Each of these groups and timeframes deserve their own episode. We could go so much deeper, but I just feel privileged to get to introduce you at large, abstractly, to an important time in our human history that literally shaped the whole world because of what was going on in 5 distinct places over just a couple hundred years. Fascinating. I'm going to link some books down below if you want to learn more about this period of time. I'll see you Sunday with a new video, and until then, keep thinking. I wanted to personally thank my top tiers of support, my Iconoclast, Ann, Boris, GVI, Jimmy, Joe, Kitboga, Matthew, Perry, Shawn, and Steve, my Humanist heroes, Craig, James, Jarrod, Kristi, and Matthew, my Atheist advocates, Aquitar, Caleb, Dan, David, Drew, Jeff, Jeffrey, Julie, Malcom, Paul, Sparky, and Thomas, as well as all of my secular scholar patrons. If you believe in the mission of this channel or you just enjoy its content, please consider joining these fine people.